4 true chilling murderer encounter horror stories. Story number 1. First, a little background information. I worked the night shift at a local gas station when I was 19. I'm a female about 5'6", and I was the only employee in the store as usual. On Christmas Eve, I had to work the overnights, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. to Christmas Day. It was a normal night with no customers, and my training is almost finished. I just got done eating and decided to go out for a smoke when I saw someone was walking towards the store in the distance. This was nothing out of the ordinary, till the person gets to the pumps and I actually see that it was a male, about 5'9", and someone said he was wearing dark jeans and was carrying a gift bag. As he got closer though, I noticed that as he approached me, I asked if he was okay, if he needed any help. I noticed the red flag, and the eyes looking dead inside, I want to help, that don't call the cops. I agreed to tell him that there was a first aid kit inside, but I'd be happy to help him with his wound. Crazy, I know, but I was just trying to be nice to him, since he was someone who could be a threat to me. We went inside the store and I got the first aid kit. As I pulled that to stuffing and to clean himself up, he said we needed to use the restroom, and once again told me not to call the cops. I told myself that wasn't the bathroom. Within a reasonable amount of time, I was going to call the police. So I went outside and called the dispatcher, and they told me to stay out of the store and find someplace safe to be until the officers arrived. I stood at the side of the store where I wouldn't be able to see. Police arrived, asked me where he was. I pointed out the door. Just as they approached the door, he opened it and tried to muster one of the officers. Officers tackled the fact that he was holding a knife and arrested as they were walking in and out of the store. Officer told me that I was lucky that the police got there when they did see me again. I was a little shocked by that. One of the officers came to take my statement after the other took the guy away. I told the officer what had happened. I asked something I really wish I didn't know the answer to, what he was doing in the bathroom. The officer told me that it was a good thing that I called. Why? Because the guy had shot up some error when in the bathroom that was going to come out with a knife, stab me, and run with what money was in the register. That's what the bag was for. This guy had a lot of problems and a lot of anger inside of it. The reason he was so angry was also the reason his head was believing he owed his dealer money and Godspeed because his solution to the problem was robbing the store. The officer told me if I didn't call when I did, I would be critically wounded or dead, because he wasn't going to allow me to stand between him and that money. I hope I never see that crazy drug addict who wanted to kill me to free himself again. Story number 2. In 2006, I was a college student at Arizona State. I live in Moore campus apartment on the ground floor of a major street here in Phoenix called Baseline. That summer was plagued by 2 serial killers. One was known as a Phoenix shooter, who ended up being a team of 2 guys, randomly shooting people. The other was the Baseline killer, a rapist murderer who was targeting victims in my neighborhood. Other 2 active serial killers put the entire city on edge, and everyone was talking about it. I even saw articles in the newspapers. There's like Time and Newsweek about the fall 2006 semester had just started at the time. Now you may already know this, but Phoenix is hot. In August, it would get really stuffy in my apartment, so I'd usually leave the window cracked a little bit to get some cool morning air into the wide sound person visual uncovered. One morning, a strange sound, and it was the crack of dawn, right before 5 a.m., and the sun had barely come on. It was the sound of light tapping on the window, and it seemed intentional in my tired state. I figured it was just a bird or some tree branches all over to try and fall back asleep. So after about 90 seconds of the tapping returned, that same pattern. and I knew at that point it was absolutely purposeful. I was positive that must be coming from a person outside my window. Of course, I assumed it was my boyfriend at the time, so he thought it was cute to try and scare me sometimes, feeling a little bit ratty. I decided to make him wait, but after a while continued tapping, and I started to get angry. I was definitely going to have to give him a piece of my mind for bothering me so early. I lay there in silence, annoyed, as the topic continued every few minutes. After a while, I got up to get a glass of water, trying to think of ways to get my boyfriend back for a stupid prank. What I'm saying, some movements in the spring. The winds, I finally marched over and yanked them to the side, ready to confront my boyfriend. I get what the F he was taken aback by my anger, but only slightly suspicious of that man outside my window that morning, or specifically his eyes, feeling that words can't do justice to how to hurt his eyes, where they look like black or absolutely predatory. When I see pictures of killers like Ted Bundy or Charles Manson, that's exactly the pictures don't do it justice. It's totally different when you experience something like that in person. I was totally floored. Simply about this man. He was crouched down. He was wearing dark clothes and a Nike hat. After I yelled at him, he told me, "Can we talk?" That sentence in a stranger still sells chills down my spine to think of how those words. His hands suddenly moved towards his waist. Later learned that he would blitz attack his victims, and he was usually armed with a gun. All that separated us was the window's screen. This was only about 3 seconds interaction at this point, so I didn't have much time to think. Even so, I thought of how we pretend to be crippled to learn as victims. I thought of my mom telling me not to be nice to strangers and to never be afraid to be a bitch. My thinking wasn't quite as calculated as that, but I had just enough time to process the responses. I tried to figure out how to deal with the situation. Right after he whispered to me, I started yelling at him. "Hell no, get the fuck out of here, douchebag." Shut the window angrily. It was pretty easy to be a bitch, as my mom had advised, when I was so incredibly irritated that this person had the audacity to disturb my precious sleep. I laid back down and started wondering if I had to. What if he did, but that didn't really make sense. Why would he be tapping at my window for so long and whispering if he was truly in trouble? I decided he must be a creep after all. I was too annoyed to fall back asleep, but I stayed in bed for a while to try and get some rest. I told my roommate about an hour later when I finally got out of bed. She sort of jokingly asked if it could have been the baseline killer. When she said that, my heart sank, and I thought about it. His face was exactly like the police sketches that were on billboards everywhere. The only difference was that the man in the schedules has dreads, and the man had been at my window. As I was to find out later, he was actually a disguise artist who would frequently wear wigs. The similarities were just too much for me to brush off, so I called the Phoenix police detectives, came over to the apartment. He agreed that it sounded like the killers. The suspect would say something to throw his target off, and then he'd surprise attack other attention. The detective said that my angry response probably made me too much so the killer just moved on. I figured that he'd come back and search for evidence or get surveillance video or something, but I ended up getting freaked out when I told them. They got us knives and pepper spray and put up sand about the site. After seeing this, another tenant in the building came forward to say that they go to the police about a similar experience that same morning. I never went into details, but this idiot was apparently going on the whole complex trying to find a target. The building managers are ridiculous and wouldn't let us out of our lives. So we just ended up to a second-floor apartment right above our old unit. That old unit must have been cursed somehow, because the new tenants were horrible and noxious tweakers who would do drugs, blast music on repeat for hours, and have night parties at 11 a.m. on weekdays. There were times where I wonder if they might be worse than the actual serial killer. Anyway, on September 4, 2006, shortly after my encounter, they arrested Market. I figured the detective never called me back because they were days when I saw his mugshot. I felt sick is absolutely the guy that happened outside my window. He's on death row in Arizona, and his wife tried to start some campaign to prove that the police were framing him, or something, but luckily no one believed her. I certainly would have made for an interesting coincidence if some poor innocent man who they had framed was also whispering like a creep and tapping on my window. One interesting personal detail about this story is that I had been suffering from an awful eating disorder at the time, and about 8 months after my running with the baseline killer, I was finally important covering. I never would have expected how a near-death experience like that would have turned my life around. My one word of advice to anyone listening to this story is don't be afraid to be downright rude to someone who's injecting themselves into your space and making them more comfortable. Trust your instincts. If you're not afraid to tell someone, could save your life. Story number 3. To give some background in my story, I was 6, living with my mom. My sister was 9 and my brother was 11 when my father died. After a few years, my mom started dating again. She ended up talking to this guy after meeting him for a handyman job. Our sink broke and my mom found him in the yellow pages. After that, they started talking and eventually started dating. After a few months, my mom got pregnant and they decided to buy a bigger house to be able to fit us all in. So we moved to a small village away from everywhere. Only about 200 people lived in the village and the nearest town over was a 10-minute drive away. We didn't know at the time, but this man was a psychopath. We found out he had served 4 years in prison for armed robbery, which is very rare in Scotland, and he had his fair share of fights and enemies. However, by the time this was all revealed about him, our mother refused to leave him because she was so convinced he was not a worry. Plus, he was now the father of her 4-month-old baby. She ignored her sister's advice and continued dating, and after around 3 years of dating, they started binge drinking their Tesco alcohol on Mondays after getting paid on the weekend, and the kids would be going back to school. This led to a lot of arguments and frequent visits from the police to put into perspective how much of a psycho this man was. One of the police visits there was a female and a male cop that showed up. The male cop took my mother in the living room to talk to her and find out what had happened, and the female officer did the same with him. After a few minutes, everything was normal, until the female officer started screaming. The male cop ran into the kitchen, followed by everyone else wondering what the fuck just happened. Alan was on the floor with his wrist bleeding. We were all quickly rushed out of the room, but I later found out that while talking to the officer, Alan had gone to the night block, pulled out the biggest knife he could inflict his own fucking wrist. The officer, being fairly new and not expecting this from a simple row into a small peaceful village where nothing ever happened, was shocked and started screaming. That's just one example. I'll also add that Helen was very overprotective, but my mother, we didn't want her to try and leave him or talk to anyone about their regular fights. This made him insist on going anywhere with her and feeding her more so she would look less attractive to guys, so that no one would want her. She hated seeing pictures of her with her ex, aka my dad, and it made him start arguments over nothing. But one day, we went over to my aunt's house, my mom's sister, and started watching old home videos. Alan saw a few of the videos in which my dad and my mom were together. I believe the one that really pushed him was when he saw the camera turn to them when they were on the beach and they kissed. Alan was quiet on the way home that night, and you can see the anger on his face. It was just not normal. When we got home that night, things seemed to be normal, so my mom got back from her karate class, which she normally attends on Monday. I wouldn't have been drinking and confronted my mom when she came in, He then smashed a bottle on the wall and started shouting extremely loud. Normally, he would never shout this loud nor be this aggressive. At this point, they had been dating for 8 years. I was 13, my brother 19, and my sister is 16. My younger sister being 6. However, my brother was working the late shift when this happened, and my 2 sisters were both staying with their friends. So that meant it was just me, Alan, and my mother in the house at this point. Normally at this part of the argument, then my brother and sister would step in, but due to a just being against a 50-year-old that decided not to try anything and things so, after 2 or 3 hours at 11 p.m. I only saw an escalation, and after hearing my mom shouting something like drop the fucking knife, I immediately started the too familiar procedure of calling the police. I thought at the time that it was just another self-harming attempt, but this was not the fucking case here. He was holding it to my mother's level because of how often this has happened and how familiar Western the operator doubted me for a moment, passing it as a prank call from another teenager. But it was on the phone that I heard my mother without a sound that I had never heard before. Other than anything I have ever heard, I realized quickly that she had been stabbed by this psychopath. When the operator could show the distress in my voice and the screen, I was taking a little more serious. I had already been on the phone for around 4 minutes when it happened, so the police and ambulance were not that far away as they were expecting him to cut himself again. As I had explained to the operator, he had done previously. Around 2 minutes after 2 police cars were on the scene, 4 cops showed up to win around the back into one in the front. I watched from my window, which was directly above our front door, as police went into our house. After 30 seconds, I sought to come out carrying the psychopath down the stairs to their car, and the others standing at the door repeatedly asking for the ETA of the ambulance, which showed up about 5 to 6 minutes after the police started to check the house for anyone in it, just in case there was another suspect. When it came to my room, a huge cop came in and shined his light around my room. He then told me to stay in the room and not to leave. I didn't know the condition of my mother at the time. I just assumed it was bad as the road was closed, as well as the one behind our house. 2 ambulances and a doctor's emergency response vehicle. Well, I would tell my 20 or 30 times, if not more. Our house was on the corner of the street. Police were around to every 10 feet of our garden, not letting anyone near the house, garden, or streets. After a while of waiting in my room, detective came up to my room, told me my mother was pronounced dead at the scene, and started asking me questions about what happened. I was then escorted down the stairs. Around 10 officers were lined up to try and block my view of the room where my mother was. Like the cops, all have their hands up their chest and shook my hands as I walked past them, and now I saw paramedics surrounding my mother starting to back up. They looked exhausted. Alan was sentenced to 16 years in jail, and I am so thankful that police responded so fast. If they hadn't, who knows what would have happened. The paramedics worked so hard to try and save my mother. She was struck straight through the heart with a single step. Years before Alan murdered my mother, there were a lot of domestic fights and arguments. Resulting in a wall or a face having ended up in a relationship like this can help and trust you. Story number 4. This happened a long time ago, in the late 90s. I was 19, and I'd just moved from Oregon to Florida with my boyfriend at the time, which I wouldn't recommend. Thinking about was the white sand beaches and Mickey Mouse, but instead about the swamp, bugs, and dirt roads. It was an unpleasant shock to my system, to say the least. We lived in a little town right outside of Gainesville. I also recommend never going there. There was only one stoplight and 4 stores: Dollar General, Steve's Markets, Records Pharmacy, and Sonny's Barbecue. I got a job at the now defunct Efforts in the middle of town. It was right next to the grocery store, so everyone shopped there about 3 months or so into my job. I walked in to start my shift one day. My manager pulled me into his office, laid out on his desk for about 30 to 40 unopened letters, all hand addressed to me. "Do you know this person?" my manager asked me. I was confused and said no. When I picked up a triple yellow like, and one appeared inside the envelope with 2 handwritten letters and the magazine cutout of a woman with blonde hair just like me. As my manager watched on, I started to read the letter, or skipped around the writing out of confusion, desperately trying to figure out why I was in this room. And what I was reading, it sounded like someone was just imagining like spending time with me would be a lot of letter was sexual in nature. There were expensive comments about my hair, what it would be like to wash and smell. A few of the sentences were highlighting others where I couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening. My first thought was, am I getting fired? "Do you know this, David Rod?" I said yes. I think the tall, lanky guy with thick glasses and pretty dark hair. The regular comes in a couple times a week to pick up a Diet Coke and medication for his late 20s, seeing socially or mentally challenged. On rare occasions, who makes small talk was I rang up his soda. Once or twice, he had lingered on my register, stared at me. I figured he was just trying to adjust his eyes or for social skills. I was really, compared to some of the other people, I never paid him any mind. Until that day and the letters, but I have a strange encounter 2 weeks prior. I was working and it came up behind me. My hair had to remove it from his hands. He apologized. It was definitely weird, but again, he seemed harmless, so I just went back to work after retelling this experience to my manager. He informed me that David would be banned from the store. I was being sent home already, worked out the details. Confused, I walked out of the store and drove home. Strange. 2 hours after I got home, there was a knock at my door. I picked out the window to see what looked like a SWAT team. What the F? Removing tactical gear with large weapons to men dressed in suits and several uniformed police officers in what felt like slow motion at the time I opened the door. A female officer at the front of the group held up a few letters. "Can we come in and talk to you about these?" Realizing that everyone in town was to read these letters by now, I wanted to pass out. I didn't even know the guy. I invited the officer in, and we had a seat on my couch, as she began to speak out of the corner. So my boyfriend, shooting me dirty looks from the bedroom, the officer explained how she got the letters from records, attempting to issue trespassing orders. They wanted to speak to him directly because her department, the officers, had confronted him at his residence and attempted to trespassing notice for the store. Apparently wasn't happy about those. He insisted for over 45 minutes that this was all a big mistake and that I actually wanted to talk to them. He was so combative and persistent that they decided to pursue stalking charges. She continued, "You will need to be aware that David killed and partially dismembered his mother when he was 12 years old. He was released from a juvenile psychiatric facility less than 4 years ago. We found disturbing materials at his home. Believe he spent. It's my most favorite drink." I remember saying, David was arrested the next day after he was found in the parking lot. The last official word was that he was back in a psychiatric hospital. At least I didn't have the chance to read the letters in full before they were put away as evidence. And the police never told me exactly what they found at his house. I never really did have a complete picture of what was happening. My boyfriend at the time was a huge ass about mobile phones, so I moved back to Oregon a week later without ever getting any closure.